And I'd like to welcome everybody to our talk. We're calling this let's see if I have, well, I have the first draft of the title here. Somebody can correct me, but I think it's now The Ambiguous Legacy of Kristallnacht, Nazis, Jewish Resistors, and Anti-Semitism in Germany and Los Angeles. Did I get that right? Did we revise
Yes,
that?
that sounds good.
Yeah, okay. We're joined by Wolf Gruner and Steve Ross, and by our wonderful participants. What we're going to do is, and they will be talking about a few books, in fact, that they've written, and then just the broader discussion of its relevance, both to history and to the world today. And so what I'll do is I'll introduce Wolf first, and then I'll introduce Steve, give us a short biography. Then I'll ask some questions to kind of get the discussion going. And without delaying too much, I will open it up to the group to ask whatever you choose. So we have a mix of people, I think, with different interests. And so we will try to have questions and discussions that kind of appeal to everybody's curiosities and interests if we can. So without further ado, let me introduce Wolf. So Dr. Wolf Gruner holds the Shapell-Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies, is professor of history at the University of Southern California, Los Angeles since 2008, and is the founding director of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research since 2014. He is a specialist in the history of the Holocaust and in comparative genocide studies. He is the author of 10 books on the Holocaust, among them Jewish Forced Labor Under the Nazis, Economic Needs and Nazi Racial Aims with Cambridge University Press from 2008. He also published Parias de la Patria, El Mito de la Liberación de los Indígenas en la República de Bolivia, 1825 to 1890, forgive my Spanish, folks, in Spanish with Plural Editores, 2015. Gruner's most recent books are the Holocaust in Bohemia and Moravia, Czech Initiatives, German Policies, Jewish Responses. The original German version received the award for most outstanding German studies in humanities and social science. He's co-edited 4 books, Resisting Persecution, Jews and Their Petitions During the Holocaust, New Perspectives on the Kristallnacht after 80 years, the Nazi Pogrom in Global Comparison, and the Greater German Reich and the Jews, Nazi Persecution Policies in the Annexed Territories, 1935. And he's currently finishing a manuscript about the forgotten acts of individual defiance, protest, and resistance of German and Austrian Jews during the Holocaust. This book for a broader public will feature life stories of 5 Jewish men and women who defied or protested against persecution in Nazi Germany. By exploring additional courageous acts, the book will demonstrate the wide range of individual resistance. And so, of course, what Wolf will be talking about today is that penultimate book I mentioned there, which he edited with Steve, which is New Perspectives on Kristallnacht After 80 Years, the Nazi Pogrom in Jewish Comparison. He's written his own study that he's going to talk about right now, which is about the destruction of Jewish homes. And so without further ado, let me turn over to Wolf. Thank you, Wolf.
Yeah, thank you, Julian, and thanks again for the invitation to Hawaii to join Steve in this for this evening. I would rather not have COVID and be in person there, especially as Steve mentioned that we have a cold in Southern California. So thanks again. And I want to talk about this topic, the mass destruction of Jewish homes and Jewish resistance during Kristallnacht, which is one chapter of this book we co-edited together. For many decades, scholars have perceived the November pogrom Kristallnacht as the best investigated event of the Third Reich. However, we have to admit that our knowledge still seems limited. We knew that Hitler used the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris by a young Polish Jew for a violent attempt to drive the remaining Jews out of Germany. During the 9th and the 10th of November 1938, stormtroopers, SS, Hitler Youth, and civilians vandalized Jewish-owned stores, destroyed Jewish schools and orphanages, and set the majority of the synagogues in Germany ablaze. During the attacks, several hundred, as we now know, German Jews were murdered. Later, the Gestapo sent 30,000 men into concentration camps, where hundreds of them still passed away as a result of abuse, hunger, and frost. However, no systematic attention had been paid to the destruction of Jewish apartments and Jewish homes. Neither the scale and intensity of the attacks, nor the impact on the Jewish population and their responses have been ever thoroughly investigated. And this is a glaring oversight, since the attacks on Jewish homes are frequently mentioned in Jewish testimonies of survivors. So for example, in the video testimonies of the Shoah Foundation at USC, almost all German Jewish survivors describe in radical detail how intruders smashed their furniture and slashed their beds during the night of Kristallnacht.
Wolf, did you want to share your screen?
Not yet.
Okay. All right.
Interestingly, the most cited Nazi numbers do not include private homes. Heydrich reported 177 demolished synagogues in the Reich, as well as 7,500 damaged stores and 35 killed Jews. Today, we know that the actual numbers of each category were much higher, but we have yet to find an estimate about the damage done to the private homes. And now I share my screen. So, quite in contrast to what we knew before, are numbers which we now can actually encounter in certain documents recently discovered. So for example, in Nuremberg, a city in Bavaria, several synagogues were destroyed, 70 shops, but 236 apartments, which is quite an enormous number for one city. When we take the numbers for Nuremberg and the neighboring town Fürth together, there were almost 600 apartments destroyed. In Düsseldorf, a city in the Rhineland, 400 Jewish homes were destroyed and demolished. So only in three cities, we have over 1,000 Jewish apartments totally demolished and vandalized. When one starts to investigate, evidence emerges from everywhere in Germany. Big towns, small villages, everywhere stormtroopers, the SS, Hitler Youth, and neighbors demolished Jewish homes. In Berlin, Vienna, Cologne, Duisburg, Bochum, Rostock, Leipzig, Breslau, Königsberg, and this is just a few of the cities and towns. The evidence from all these places indicates that the actual figure of destroyed homes must have been in the tens of thousands. So the question is, why didn't we know about the destruction of the apartments? One reason is a serious underreporting in the documents. Police, stormtroopers, SS, and mayors often provided only numbers after the pogrom about the synagogues and the Jewish stores. In addition, demolished apartments were often overlooked when they were in apartment buildings and or attached to synagogues and schools, and as well when they were part of stores and businesses. For example, in Kaiserslautern, the perpetrators came with iron rods and first destroyed the desks, the telephone, and the windows of Anna Blüter's business office. Later, the same night, another group appeared again with iron rods. This time, they destroyed her kitchen and her living room. Looking at the extent of the damage, it is hard to believe that this was just random. We know that during the fateful night, Goebbels sent out a circular from the Nazi propaganda office, but this document has never been found by researchers. However, some local documents suggest that Goebbels indeed, in the circular, demanded to demolish the interior furnishings of Jewish homes. Hence, across Germany and Austria, large group of perpetrators roamed villages and towns, often operating with lists and addresses from local Nazi party organizations, or even provided by the municipality. But it was not just the sheer scale and systematic nature of the attacks. Also, the intensity of the violence was unprecedented. In Beuthen, a Silesian town, the merchant Martin Fröhlich came home in the afternoon of the 10th. His door was broken, a fallen wardrobe blocked the doorway. When he entered his apartment, he had to wade through knee-deep shards and racks. Everything in his apartment had been hacked to pieces. Glass, china, clocks, instrument, furniture, lamps, paintings. Realizing that his home was inhabitable, Fröhlich felt like hit by a stroke, and he started crying as he wrote in a letter to his daughter. And let me now share some pictures I have discovered so far about where you can see a little bit of the destruction of private homes. This is the basement of the same apartment where you saw just the kitchen. And this is in Vienna. The destruction of private homes was often accompanied by frequent beatings of the tenants and residents. A Jewish woman from Vienna wrote to her relative, quote, "You can't imagine how it looked like at home. Everything ravaged and shattered. When the doctor came to help Papa, Hertha, and Rosa, who all terribly bled from their heads, we had no towel left to wipe off the blood." End of quote. Here are some photographs of where you can actually see, or these are the only photographs where you actually can see the perpetrators in action. They are from Nuremberg. And here, this is also very unique. These are the only photos we have right now of the victims of the intrusion. And here you can easily discover one of the victims of the frequent beatings during these attacks at the private homes. So these attacks were not only accompanied by beatings, but also sexual abuse, rape, and murder was very common. In Bremen, for example, SR stormed the house of Selma Swinitsky and shot her to death in her bedroom. So this large-scale violence, which kind of really Jews encountered across Germany, how did Jews react to the events of this really terrible night? Jews individually responded in different ways. Some documented the destruction of their private destroyed homes. Recently, we found pictures taken by Jews to document the destruction, as you can see here in these photos, which are taken by the Jewish resident of this apartment. And you see how it matches the description of a very different town in Silesia, which I just kind of quoted. So some Jews not only documented, but others also criticized the pogrom in public. For example, in Frankfurt, Henriette Schäfer exclaimed in front of witnesses, quote, "This was not the people, but the government. They are all blackguards, scamps, and criminals. Hitler is the biggest damn bandit. If I could, I would poison them all," unquote. And there were even some Jews who resisted physically. For example, when stormtroopers raided a Jewish agricultural training camp, they were beating up first all the young boys. Most of the trained youth were between 16 and 18. When a stormtrooper approached 16-year-old Daisy Gronowski, she was originally from Berlin, she used a jiu-jitsu trick from her, which she learned from her Zionist youth group, Hashomer HaTzair, twisted a knife from his hand and stabbed him in his stomach. He became unconscious, and this enabled her to escape into the fields with her friends. This was just a very rough kind of overview about the dimensions, the various dimensions of the brutal attacks against Jewish homes. And let me conclude by saying that although the destruction of private homes was not as visible as the burning synagogues or the looted shops, these attacks following a Goebbels order has to be acknowledged as systematic, widespread, and severe. We can only begin to fathom the enormous psychological and material toll Jewish families and individuals endured during this night and the next days. When they witnessed the demolition of furnishings, belongings, and experienced humiliation, beatings, sexual violence, and murder. Probably tens of thousands of Jews were rendered homeless. And I think taking these elements together make us better understand why so many Jewish individuals and families from this moment onwards did not see any future in Germany anymore. They either committed suicide or tried to flee, leaving everything behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wolf. You know, there's a couple of words I probably should have said in terms of context and introduction about the whole evening, which I might as well introduce sooner rather than later. And that's as of tomorrow night, the November 9th and Tuesday, November 10th, it will have been 82 years ago that Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, occurred. Wolf and Steve's collection of studies about that has a really excellent opening paragraph that just kind of describes the whole event. And I'll just read a couple of sentences to just give the bigger picture here, which is on November 9th and 10th, 1938, under the pretext of revenge for the assassination of a Nazi diplomat by a young Polish Jew, SS, SA, and citizens in Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland, acting on orders of the Nazi leadership, launched the deadliest violence in the region's history. Armed with axes and sledgehammers, with gasoline and pistols, groups of perpetrators systematically demolished Jewish synagogues, schools, businesses, and other properties while looting, beating, raping, and murdering innocent Jews. And what they go on to explain, well, it says here, you know, more than 10,000 Jewish businesses destroyed, over 2,000 synagogues, 30,000 male Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps, and several hundred more died from the beatings, starvations, and cold. What they go on to explain in the next paragraph is that the Nazis were coming to an end of their idea of just trying to make Germany and the areas under Nazi control Judenrein, meaning rid of Jews, and they were shifting to a strategy at this moment of trying to drive the Jews out. They had a hard time expelling all the Jews because other countries up until this time weren't admitting Jews as immigrants. And then when they finally got to this point, they decided they would just drive them out. And then, of course, we all know what happened when this was of limited success and there were still millions of Jews in the territory. So at this point, let me pick up with Steve. And again, we'll contextualize this better and talk about both studies once both have presented their particular research. But to introduce Steve, he's a professor of history at the University of Southern California and the Myron and Marion Director of the Casden Institute for the Study of the Jewish Role in American Life. His most recent book, Hitler in Los Angeles, How Jews Foiled Nazi Plots Against Hollywood and America, was named a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History for 2018 and has been on the Los Angeles Times bestseller list for 23 weeks. His previous book, Hollywood Left and Right, How Movie Stars Shaped American Politics, received the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences Film Scholars Award and a Pulitzer Prize nomination. Working Class Hollywood, Silent Film and the Shaping of Class in America received the Theater Library Association Book Award for 1999, as well as a nomination for the Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award. Ross's op-ed pieces have appeared in the Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Time, International Herald Tribune, Hollywood Reporter, Huffington Post, Daily Beast, and Politico. And without further ado, Steve, if you want to introduce the specific study you'll be talking about, let me hand over to you.
All right. Am I on the screen?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
We're
Well,
not sharing screen yet.
yeah. I want to tell you two stories tonight about Kristallnacht. One some of you may have heard, and the other is one you haven't heard before. And the one you have heard is the story that after the November state-sponsored violence, President Roosevelt condemned the violence, recalled German-American Ambassador to Germany, Hugh Wilson, and condemned, and he also recalled US commercial envoy Douglas Miller. Yet despite all the condemnations and the call for reparation, the United States government, like most of Western Europe, took no real action to stop German territorial aggression or the persecution of European Jews. And this failure of both American and Western leaders to stop Hitler served to actually embolden American Nazis. And now I want to share the screen. And instead of seeing me, you're going to see some of the images here. And let's start with, at one point, I know we're going to link some of this discussion to today. And as frightening as things are in the last 4 years, I want you to look at this map of downtown Los Angeles in the 30s and 40s. Everything in red is either a Nazi or fascist group. Everything in blue are the Jews, the key Jewish characters in the city, and the green are some of the resistors. And I just want to say I could not fit all the Nazi and fascist groups that are in this downtown area. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been able to see any of the street signs. Well, on November 16th, 1938, local Bund leader Hermann Schwinn, the #2 Nazi in the United States, addressed an excited crowd who came to Deutsche House to celebrate Kristallnacht. And stepping up to the podium, surrounded by stormtroopers dressed in full uniform, Schwinn blamed Jews for causing the massacres and told them that American Christians were finally waking up to the Jewish menace. And he predicted that within less than 5 years, we will see Jews dangling from telephone posts and trees. And this is Schwinn in front of Deutsche House. For any of you who know Los Angeles, this is Figueroa and 15th Street, right near it's the parking lot now for our convention center. Well, in the wake of Kristallnacht, Hitler's minions in Los Angeles and throughout the United States began preparing for their Tag, the day that Nazis and their supporters would seize control of the American government either through force or the ballot box. And Schwinn believed that guns and well-drilled troops would prove more useful than votes in attaining his vision of a Jew-free America. Well, American Nazi aggression was not confined to Los Angeles, but in fact was a national phenomenon. 3 weeks after Kristallnacht, LA Stormtroop leader Mike Dry read a 21-page set of secret orders sent from Bund headquarters in New York City, instructing local members to begin rigorous training in firearms and hand-to-hand combat. Okay, here we go. There's Schwinn addressing the crowd. Over the next several months, stormtroopers held shooting practice on a regular basis, sometimes at the pistol range set up on the second floor of Deutsche House, other times in the deserted Hollywood Hills far away, and other times still at an area in the Pacific Palisades that was being built to house Hitler's Western White House. As Schwinn's lieutenant Reinhold Kusch quipped, quote, "It seems like we're in the army now." Well, raising and training well-drilled military forces was only part of Schwinn's strategy for bringing National Socialism into the United States. To take over the American government, he needed to build a cadre of dedicated citizens who would support his vision of an Aryan nation. And following Kristallnacht, Bundists began creating a network of secret cells, each no larger than 10 people, that would be spread across the country. And they modeled those cells on the system that Hitler used in the 1920s. Meetings were held in secret cells, and no one knew the existence of the other. By the end of December 1938, basically 6 weeks later, the Bund had organized 18 cells and anticipated more. But in addition to these cells, Schwinn and his lieutenant Hans Diebel also began organizing what they called private discussion groups in the homes of sympathetic Americans who supported the Nazis, but did not want that fact known to their neighbors and acquaintances. Now, Bund meetings were attracting usually between 250 and 300 people, but Schwinn wanted to build a network that ran into the tens of thousands. Here you have a picture that you might think is Nazi Germany, but these are Nazi supporters in LA. This takes place in Hindenburg Park, which is 17 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles. By early 1939, a number of these people would have been part of the more than 100 discussion groups spread throughout greater Los Angeles. And the leaders of these groups were not simply right-wing crazy people, but they included prominent members of the city social register, such as wealthy Beverly Hills socialite, Mrs. Preston Harris Fisher, who recruited like-minded women from the city's exclusive women's club. Well, Hermann Schwinn knew that he had to form a broad coalition. And so he also turned to the anti-Semites that existed at that time, in fact, far more visible than are white supremacists today. Silver shirts, Ku Klux Klan, Japanese and Italian fascists, Mexican gold shirts, and white Russians, those people who brought you the pogroms in Eastern Europe. Well, the Nazi cohort was growing far more dangerous than ever, and yet local and federal authorities proved totally complacent, preferring instead to focus their energies on keeping alleged communists under surveillance. With over 750 Nazi and fascist groups operating in the United States in 1939, and almost all of them cooperating with the Bund, Schwinn's vision of establishing a Jew-free nation did not seem so far-fetched. Well, the eventual Nazi defeat in Los Angeles would not come from public protests or from any of the actions of government agencies. Rather, Schwinn and his cohort would be brought down by a small group of men and women led by the man that Nazis referred to as the most dangerous Jew in Los Angeles. In August 1933, several days after the Los Angeles Nazis held their first open meeting in which they declared their goal was to rid the nation of the communist Jewish threat, Jewish attorney, World War I veteran, and the founding executive secretary of the Anti-Defamation League, Leon Lewis, approached 4 members of the disabled American veterans and asked them and their wives to risk their lives by going undercover and spying on every Nazi and fascist group in America. Here we have John Schmidt.
Steve, your audio.
The spies sent him daily reports describing Nazi and fascist plans for murder and sabotage. He recruited John Schmidt, who was the son of a German general who had fought he left Germany at the age of 16, fought with Pershing, General Pershing in Mexico, and then fought against his own family for the American forces in Europe. He also recruited Carl Sunderland, who had been in the cavalry his whole life. He recruited Major C. Burt Allen, and finally, Colonel William Conley, his only Jewish spy. And the reason he recruited him is Conley was the head of the National Disabled American Veterans. Well, in the months after Kristallnacht, Lewis and his associate, Joe Roos, began fighting their enemies on two fronts: an expanded secret undercover operation and a more public relations campaign. They recruited 3 new undercover operatives after Kristallnacht, and a series of trusted informants who reported on potential sabotage at military installations. Roos, who was a former newspaper man, also launched a propaganda campaign by putting out the newsletter. And in the newsletter, he took the spy reports and turned them into a kind of dramatic, almost novelistic mystery of the Nazis in LA. Well, all the information they gathered from their spies, they also sent to the FBI, to Army intelligence, and Navy intelligence. Well, the greatest legacy of Kristallnacht in LA would come on December 8th, 1941, when local FBI agents rounded up hundreds of suspected German, Italian, and Japanese spies and fifth columnists. And yet there was one problem. When you look at the FBI page, and you can go onto their website for Pearl Harbor, it looks incredible. Within 48 hours, they have virtually every dangerous Nazi and fascist in the city. But there's one problem. I asked myself, how did they know who to arrest? Because when I got Hermann Schwinn's Freedom of Information Act file, and again, I will remind you, Hermann Schwinn is the #2 Nazi in the United States, only superseded by Fritz Kuhn in New York City. Well, his FBI file started in early 1941. So how did the FBI know who to arrest? Well, they simply took the massive amount of information and lists that Leon Lewis and Joe Roos had sent them, lists divided into dangerous, keep under surveillance, and for highly dangerous, and keep under surveillance. They simply labeled them A, B, and C, and took full credit. Joe Roos, Leon Lewis never cared because the job got done. So what's the take-home story for all of this? The fertile history of American Jewish response to Kristallnacht and resistance to Nazism within our own country still needs to be told. As the story of Leon Lewis and Joe Roos tells us, much of the scholarship about American reaction to Hitler has focused on leaders and national groups. And yet these weren't the people who really defeated the Nazis at home. It was without ever firing a weapon, these 2 Jewish leaders managed to keep Los Angeles and its citizens safe. They and the men and women who risked their lives to spy on Nazis and fascists understood that when a government failed to stem the rise of extremists bent on violence, it was up to every citizen to protect the lives of every other American, no matter their race, religion, or ethnicity. 82 years have passed since the events of November 9th and 10th, and 82 years later, we still need to know more about the ground level actions of Nazis and resistors in other places where Bund leaders were given a warm reception. Places like New York, Chicago, Milwaukee, all of which had large German population. And if scholars are to raise questions about passivity and cowardice, the proper focus should not be, as it has often been, on the nation's Jews, but on asking why did so-called patriotic American government authorities in so many cities turn a blind eye to Nazi and fascist activities in their own backyards? And I would suggest the answers are important today as they were 82 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. So I just want to add a couple things before I broach a couple of questions for both of them. And Steve, you may want to, depending on how it goes, you may want to shut off your video because you're having a little bit of internet connectivity issue. And if you,
Okay.
yeah, it depends. But yeah, that would be a way to speed it up. You know, Steve told me, and I was excited to learn that he's actually working. I mean, this is, you know, what he's got in Hitler in Los Angeles is just an incredible, I mean, it's an important piece of history, but it's also just a really fascinating and thrilling adventure spy versus spy story. It's really disturbing how close these Nazi groups in the 30s and right at the beginning of the 40s got to a major uprising in California. And there was similar huge uprisings with the German Bund and everything on the East Coast. And he told me he's working on a sequel that will bring this whole story of then what happened with the neo-Nazi groups and I think more broadly white supremacists up through the 70s with the Anti-Defamation League. And what I thought was fascinating about that is both how that then carries over to today, but also, you know, having been a journalist who covered the Klan and neo-Nazis as a newspaper reporter, you know, and just following the news now, we're just aware that this is still going on today in the literal sense that you have extra governmental, extra law enforcement type of groups. Like I dealt a lot with the Southern Poverty Law Center, which has a big somewhat question mark over their head. Who were telling me they were infiltrating groups like the Klan up through the years when I was a reporter, which was not so long ago. And so that'll be stuff that we can talk to Steve about in a minute. But first, I want to ask both Steve and Wolf some broader questions about Kristallnacht and this broader history that they're introducing us to. One of the studies that they have in the opening is a question of nomenclature, whether Kristallnacht should be called Kristallnacht, which really refers to Night of Broken Glass. So there's, in that name, there isn't necessarily embedded the idea that of the massacres and the rape and the other horrible things that took place that night. You get a sense of vandalism, but not of, you know, the terror involved. And then the word pogrom has been used a lot, and that gets confusing because of the history in Russia with that and the differences maybe. So one of their opening studies is making the point both that maybe the word Nazi terror should be used to describe what happened that night, but also just to underscore the ferocity of the attacks that were unleashed. And so my question to Wolf and Steve is, when we talk about anti-Semitism, first of all, I have a few questions about it, but do you think that talking about the causes of anti-Semitism is something that's explicable? I've heard some people push back on the idea that you can offer historical explanations for why the Jews are picked on over and over and over again.
That's Steve, do you want to start?
No.
It's a tough one.
It's such a broad question. I mean,
How many hours do we have to be here?
Exactly. This would
Do
be
you
a
think
different
it's
night.
do you think it's answerable though?
I think it is not, for me, from my perspective, working on the Holocaust for 30 years and looking at various aspects. On the one hand, anti-Semitism is important as a driving force, but it doesn't explain everything. And that's, I think, where I see we need to be kind of have a much more complex understanding of these political, social developments. So, because otherwise you would have had the Holocaust in other countries earlier than in Germany, because there was more anti-Semitism than in Germany, like in France or Romania. So I think anti-Semitism is just one answer to this big question: why would be the persecution of the Jews and in the end a Holocaust? This would be my short answer.
So we are getting questions to the audience. Let me ask first a couple of these ones about anti-Semitism and also about this specific question of what's happened with white supremacy in America, then and now. But then I'll open up for everybody's questions. So let me just get rolling with this, and then I'm going to turn it over to the gang. So please, enter your questions in chat, or just be ready to kind of raise your electronic hand, and we'll get to as much of this as we can. Okay, I mean, Steve, did you want to say anything in follow-up?
No, let's get to the questions. I'd rather do specific questions than we can talk about anti-Semitism all night. We're not going to get anywhere.
Right. Do you think that that anything about the animus that was driving it, though, tells us anything about some of the racism or bigotry we've seen in the United States? Is there anything about the causes of what was causing the hatreds of Jews that tells us something about the controversies of racism we're having now?
No, it's been with us. It's been with us since the nation was created. And here's what I will tell our audience, that it was as bad as is it today. It was worse in the 30s and 40s. We mark the moment of modern white supremacy, and I mean very modern, recent, with Charlottesville. And what were they chanting there? The Jews will not replace us. In the 1930s and 40s, and I'm talking about in the 40s, even after Pearl Harbor in LA, you can look at the LA Times, and there are sermons being preached, and they put down in the LA Times, they advertise what the sermon's going to be that week, and their sermon, "Shall we kill the Jew?" There are people openly calling, I would say, at either Bund meetings, Silver Shirt meetings, or various other right-wing groups in the 40s, virtually once a month, somebody is calling for death to Jews. And death to Jews, they're singling out Jews, but blacks are even lower on the totem pole there. At least whites, Jews are sort of white, but they deserve to die just as well as blacks do. So we are talking about a period that I would say you can trace this back actually to the Civil War, and it's never been resolved. We've never resolved it. Why do you think we have the controversy over the statues today? People get afraid of people who are not like them. We know throughout history, people have searched for scapegoats, and in different civilizations at different times, there have been different scapegoats. And this has not stopped. What we have is, and again, I would say things were worse in the 30s and 40s than they are today.
Okay, let me ask about the stuff you were working on specifically, Steve, regarding infiltration. And you really tell kind of a spy versus spy story. And I mean, one of the things that leaps out about the connection with today is, there were reports that the Department of Homeland Security saw white supremacy as a #1 terrorist threat, but there have been people who left the Trump administration because they felt that this was suppressed. That was a story in the news lately. So this issue of the government not investigating or not being at the forefront or missing some of it, and the idea that other groups have taken it on, this is not new. As you mentioned in doing your follow-up book, the ADL continued this kind of work for decades, right? And as I was saying, I know that in having done stories about the Klan and neo-Nazis, that the Southern Poverty Law Center does investigations like this, although I don't know if they're comparable to what the ADL has done. And I know there's been a real shadow over the Southern Poverty Law Center and what they've done. So it's a complicated question, but I wonder if you can offer any insight into, it seems like that's part of the nature of the issue. You've got these underground groups, and then you've got these other groups like the ADL infiltrating them that are not part of the government. And this entire thing has been going on for decades. It's kind of disturbing and fascinating at the same time.
Well, back going to my undergraduate days and through graduate school, I have been in political theory. That has been my other love. And in political theory, If you take a look at the theory of the state and legitimacy of a state, the first and most fundamental obligation of a state is to protect the lives of its citizens. When a state can no longer to protect the lives of its citizens, it ceases to be a legitimate state. In the 1930s, J. Edgar Hoover, if I can be blunt, didn't give a shit about Jews. He spent, to the extent in the early 30s, they had 300 FBI agents in 1933, roughly. And most of them were on the East Coast. And to the extent that he was going to have any of his agents monitoring groups, it was only going to be communists. Because J. Edgar Hoover, and I would argue that government officials since then, in our State Department and other government agencies, right through Donald Trump, have never really seen right-wing groups as a danger. Why? Because right-wing groups wrap themselves in American flags, call themselves patriots, and you can read other undercover agents who did this independently will also tell you, in my own investigation, the most right-wing groups either call themselves the nationalist this and that, or the Christian this and that. They are God, Jesus, and country, and they are none of those things. They're not godly, they're not the true first century Jesus, and they're not true American citizens, because American citizens do not persecute other American citizens because of their race, their ethnicity, or their religion. You may not like the person next to you, but they have just as much a right to live a life undisturbed as you do. And I want to point out the First House Un-American Activities Committee, which has gone on to become, the Red Scare and the Reactionary Committee, was actually started by a Jew, an Lower East Side Jew, Samuel Dickstein, who had just come back in the early 30s, 1933, from Germany, and had seen what was going on after Hitler came into power. And he called on Congress to set up a House Un-American Activities Committee to investigate the dangers of Nazism and fascism in America. And the only way Congress approved it was he had to add on, they would also investigate communists. Well, it was supposed to be equal, half communists, half right-wing groups. And in fact, in the first report they put out in 1935, 75% of the report was communists, 25% were fascists and Nazis. And when you go to the post-war in 1945, when HUAC was meeting, they were holding countless meetings investigating communist activity in Hollywood and around the world. They held one 15-minute meeting, about fascism, and declared there was no fascist threat to America.
Steve,
Julian, can I add something?
Paid attention to these groups.
Julian, can I add something to this? So I think what Steve just described needs to be also a little bit contextualized, because there is this larger society trend to have sympathies for certain arguments which white supremacists, racists have. And I think this is a historical trend which you find not only in the US, but for example, in Germany. Right in the 1920s, you have political murder done by Nazis. They had sympathies in the judicial system among politicians. The Nazis came to power not alone. They shared goals together with conservative parties, and that's how they came to power, not kind of on their own. And then after the war in Germany, you have also neo-Nazis in several waves. And when there were crimes committed by these neo-Nazis, they were often portrayed, and this is very the same happens here in the US, as individuals, never as part of a movement or a part of a party or a member of a party. They were always portrayed as individuals, isolated individuals who go crazy, and that's it. And when you have somebody going into a synagogue shooting people, the individual is treated not as part of a larger network, right? It is just an individual who is kind of ideologically fanatic, and that's the only explanation. But the whole network of structural kind of support, political sympathy, that's actually what explains this kind of very one-sided approach. And you see this in pre-Nazi Germany, post-war Germany, and I see this similar also in the United States.
So there's a question of, I mean, we're dealing with a problem that to some degree we're going to leave as either mysterious or built into human DNA and built into society that never leaves us. You guys have pointed to a problem with effective government vigilance and response. That's also been an ongoing thing. Let me ask you both this. We now live in an age of the internet where groups that were operating underground can now seek each other out. You know, if I was a crank in somewhere in the hinterlands of America before, I can now find all kinds of like-minded people. And from what I've heard from intelligence people, the internet makes it that much easier to coordinate and operationalize plans. If you want to go knock over a National Guard armory or plot the kidnapping of a governor of Michigan, it's much easier now with the internet to enact these kind of things. So I wanted to ask you if you guys would want to comment on that now and then turn it over. We have a number of questions already from the group, so.
Well, I can tell you this, when the Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee towards the end of World War II, each had been running undercover operations along with a third group called the Non-Sectarian Anti-Nazi League. And all three of those groups, the leaders of all three were writing memos then that I've gone over. And they said that the two greatest fears, and this again, this is 1944, 45, 46, and they kept writing this up through the 50s. Their two greatest fears were, one, they said, we can deal with any single hate group, including the Klan. We can deal with that. Our greatest fear is that all these groups are going to get together somehow and form a united fascist front. And we can deal with them individually, but if they all combine, we're in big trouble. And that's what we're seeing on the internet now, that they're moving towards the ability to forge a united fascist front. And the other thing they said is some of these groups, there's a difference between very conservative groups and white supremacist groups. And the danger is that the white supremacist groups will eventually pass themselves off as simply conservative groups and become part of one of the two mainstream parties. And at that point, they will push the whole agenda of the party towards an agenda of hate. And this is stuff they're saying in 1945, 1946. And I think we've seen it realized over the last 4 years.
That's a scary thought. Wolf, did you have anything to add to that, or should we get to the questions from the group?
Yeah, I'm on the one hand, I see this as a point that the internet enables new kind of on a much faster scale these kind of things. But on the other hand, when you think about the 1920s or in Germany, people always knew how to find their kind of co-thinkers, people like-minded people. They knew they would kind of go to certain places. They had certain pubs where they would kind of where they were known who was kind of there. So I think in every society you have possibilities to network. Just the means are different. If you use kind of mail or internet, I think just the speed is different today. But on the other hand, I would say there is also some good in the internet, because it enables actually more democratic kind of response. It enables also individual responses. It enables also the FBI to control these things better. So it's not just kind of a negative effect. There's also a counterbalance there, which the internet enables, in my view.
Okay, so here's a question. I'm looking at the chat. There's quite a few in the chat, and Peter's given us a bunch of excellent questions. Peter, if I may, I really like this one because of Wolf's done so much great work on physical Jewish resistance during the Nazi era. And so for Wolf, the question was, are the examples of Jewish physical resistance representative or isolated examples? How representative is the young woman with the Jew, and can I add to that? how good is the evidence that she really pulled these jujitsu moves and took the knife away? And is that anecdotal or according to her, or do we have, you know?
So yeah, that's a good question. In my new book, I have a whole chapter on physical resistance, and the main story is her story, which is from an interview of the Shoah Foundation. But what I did is I cross-checked all the incidents she describes in her interview, and most, kind of the overwhelming majority of what she describes in her narrative is actually you can prove by other documents or other sources. For example, she describes in her interview that she met, when she escaped Germany, the Swiss ambassador. And I thought, this is kind of really weird. Why would and she said he saved her. And then turns out it was not the ambassador, but it was the Swiss consul in Cologne who was an anti-Nazi, and she was actually taking the train from Cologne. So there is a total validity that she met this Swiss diplomat there. So I could various by using other kind of elements of her narrative confirm this. And my studies on individual Jewish resistance kind of unearthed quite a bit of physical self-defense. For example, you have starting with teenagers and adolescents who kind of are harassed and attacked by Hitler Youth. You have dozens and dozens of kind of testimonies that they defended themselves. And interestingly, not just males, but also females who were attacked. So that's a kind of, there is kind of quite a lot of evidence of this. And then you have not so much in the archives, but there are some documents where Jews were arrested for kind of defending themselves or even attacking stormtroopers who harassed others. So that's actually quite common that young Jews would beat up stormtroopers who kind of harassed Jewish elderly woman or a Jewish neighbor. So it's not totally rare. I would not say this is the rule, but I think there is more than we actually expect or we suspected. And this kind of in overall kind of is only one element of a huge variety of individual resistance, which I work on, and which is really from public protest to kind of neglecting anti-Jewish laws till physical self-defense. So there's a wide range of this kind of resistance. And they all, most of them, not in the case of Daisy Gronowski, but in most cases, these Jews got arrested. For example, one young Jew who defended his father during Kristallnacht, he was shot by the SS and burned in the synagogue. I mean, that's also why we don't know much about physical self-defense, because most of them were kind of caught and had and paid with their lives.
Okay, so Peter, you had I don't know if you want to ask them, you had a couple questions about, well, even more, you said, what about local sheriffs and cops who are part of the white supremacist movement? This is, I guess, for Steve, such as the KKK and the Nazis. Were local LAPD part of the German Bund?
It's a bad story when people read about the corruption of the LAPD, but particularly LAPD, they don't talk about corruption as much as they talk about racism. In the sheriff's department, you have corruption and you have a racism. And here's what I would tell you from the archives I looked at. Within a week of the attack of Pearl Harbor, the sheriff was making a deal, the LA County sheriff, with the local Ku Klux Klan. And we know this because the Klan's chief of recruiting for Southern California was one of Leon Lewis's spies. And he found out that, in fact, the sheriff was willing to make a political deal with the Nazis, with the Klan, that he would, the Klan had announced they would have a recruiting drive. They said, now that we're in this war that we were pushed in by Jews and pro-British people, we're going to get back at them. We promised that we would get them if they got us into war, and now we will. And so they wanted the sheriff to supply Klan members with guns. And in fact, the sheriff created a special network within the sheriff's department. He deputized a number of the Klan members, and in exchange, the Klan promised to vote for him. And I have a dialogue that Chuck Slocum repeats where one of the sheriff's advisors said, "Sheriff, is this really a good idea? This is the Ku Klux Klan you're talking about." And the sheriff said, "Politics is politics," and went ahead. The sheriff and police department didn't have many active members that I could find who were actually in the Bund. Some of them went to meetings, but there were many active members who were in the Silver Shirts, which was the American equivalent of the Bund. The Silver Shirts were an American fascist group created right after Hitler came to power. And they shared basically the same things as Hitler. They hated communists, they hated Jews, they hated blacks, and they hated Catholics. And you had a lot of people there. And in fact, I discovered some of the sheriff and police people were part of some of the Nazi plots. They joined in them.
It was a real
Julian,
challenge.
could I ask a follow-up question that dovetails a bit with that? And excuse me for not writing it down in the chat room.
Sure.
It's to Steve, and it has to do with the background of these people like Schwinn and others in the group. In 1930s and 1940s Los Angeles, surely the vast majority of people there were recent newcomers to the area, at least first or second generations. So what do you know about their background, and what sort of patterns do those backgrounds reveal, if any, or conclusions can be drawn about the people who you've identified?
Well, in a nutshell, what I saw, first of all, German Americans were the largest ethnic group in Los Angeles. In 1930 census, I believe there were 150,000 German Americans in the city, which made them the largest group. And what I discovered, there was a big split within the German community. You had the older Germans, I mean, literally, both had been here generations and were older. People who were the ancestors of the Turnverein, the Turners who left, kind of liberal and leftists who left Germany in 1948. And by the 1930s, many of them were no longer, I would say, liberals and left, but they weren't right-wingers. They may not have loved Jews, but they weren't openly, and if they were anti-Semitic, they weren't openly so. Schwinn was part of a younger generation of German immigrants, and the most active group in the Bund were in fact German immigrants who had come to America, most of whom had citizenship, but some of whom refused to take out citizenship because there were too many Jews in America, and too many Jews and blacks, so they wouldn't do it. They were the ones who really led the kind of right-wing revolt within the city. And they were opposed early on by the older Germans, and they lost the battle to the older Germans.
So, so I think it's Jim Corcoran. Do I have your first name right, Jim? You had a couple comments. One was about reparations, but the other was about education about Kristallnacht here at Hawaii Pacific University and elsewhere. Do you want to take on either of those? You got to unmute yourself, Jim. Andrew, do you know why? Sorry, Jim, hold on. You haven't.
I just gave him permission. So yeah, just hit a click now, unmute.
Try it again, Jim. Well, it's not working. Let me see if I can scroll up and find it. I'm sorry, Jim. Try again. Okay, let me read it, Jim, because it's not working. You said, in my history courses at Hawaii Pacific University, I have my students view the many videos, photos of Kristallnacht and related history on the net. Note that the web provides extensive information on Kristallnacht and other history relating to Nazi rule. The younger generation needs to see and to learn. Now, this is really in your well, both of your wheelhouses, of course, but I mean, as the director and founder of the Shoah Center, Wolf, I wonder if you'd want to say anything about Holocaust education and resources.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think definitely the Holocaust and or the topic of today, the Kristallnacht, are important elements in history which we have to kind of educate the younger generation. But I think it is always important to not isolate them, but to really kind of also show like that this is a trend which is not only existing in Germany, far away, and therefore somehow distant. And so I think what really works is also to connect this, as Steve does, with his story. But for example, when you think about Kristallnacht, there are so many programs in US history, starting in the 19th century into 20th century, in different cities against Chinese, against Latin Americans, against Black Americans. So to kind of combine these histories, I think, is a good tool to make this more understandable for students and bring this closer to home. So I co-taught a seminar comparing Jim Crow and the Nazi Germany 30s. And it was really striking how many parallels there are in these two periods, which really speak to an often overlooked element of history, which is local history. The participation of local kind of authorities, from law enforcement to municipalities, mayors, who are instigating violence against minorities. And I think this is really where you can draw the parallels and kind of bring this closer to home for the students.
Okay, speaking of students, we should be wrapping up, but I did want to make sure, I know we have at least a couple of my students in here, Nina and Nena. Do any of the students have any questions?
I didn't really have any questions. I was just kind of interested in the conversation after you emailed us, especially with everything that's been going on in regards to politics and the election. So I just wanted to see what everyone was talking about for that.
Nana, you're particularly interested in kind of First Nation issues. You just did your story for my class on Indigenous Peoples Day and some of the controversies around that. Do you see any direct connections with this history, or is there anything you want to ask about with it? This is kind of a unique opportunity to have you folks speaking of this to Hawaii people, where we have so many issues of Native rights. Can you think of anything, Nana?
On the spot, not exactly. I didn't really prepare anything ahead of time because I didn't really know what to expect for listening to the conversation. But I did do that project.
I mean, I guess what leaps to, I would ask just kind of an open question maybe to both Steve and Wolf, when you think, in particular about First Nation issues, the kind of fraught history that the mainland of the USA has had with Hawaii and the people who are from here, which is still very much a live concern for a lot of people here. And then, I mean, one thing that leaps out to me was I think for a lot of people here, what happened on July 4th with the Mount Rushmore thing that Trump did, where he very deliberately did a shout out to arresting the people who had torn down the Andrew Jackson statue, was just a remarkable and horrifying day. And Trump supporters taunting members of I think it was the Lakota tribe on their own land, where they were being exposed to the virus because of them allowing that event to take place there. That to me really brought a lot of the First Nation issues up in a scary way.
I mean, I would agree, and it goes actually beyond, because it was against the will of the Dakota people to actually to have this event there, because they were actually trying to prevent this, because it was on their own lands, right? So, but the neglect of indigenous rights is kind of blatant and a long story in history. My center, we are preparing a big international conference on mass violence against indigenous communities, and where we compare North America, South America, and the Pacific region. And we will have also a contribution about Hawaii, which is about kind of more current aspects, where there's a lot of talk about systemic racism in the kind of US society, but this is not only against African Americans, it is against indigenous people too. And for example, the mass incarceration of indigenous people is part of the whole story, which is often forgotten because the focus is so much on Black Americans. And I think the discrimination of Native nations is a very kind of still very current problem, which is often much less talked about than about Kristallnacht, for example, which I find it's a very big imbalance. And that's why we are doing this big conference, which was supposed to happen on Indigenous Peoples' Day last week, 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. And now we postponed it because of COVID to next year. But we will live stream this, so I invite everybody to participate.
Steve, did you have a comment?
Yes, one of the things that's going on at USC right now, as it is going around the country, is reckoning with our own past and our present. We have a new president, and she renamed one of the buildings, Van Kleinschmidt, because he was a eugenicist, and he was the president from the 20s through the 40s. He was a eugenicist. And after World War II, he refused to allow Japanese American students to enroll at USC. I then, without getting into a long thing, contacted her, for which I was blown off, talking about the anti-Semitic past at USC. And this is now, I'm organizing with our Dean of Religious and Spiritual Life a series of 4 events, because it seems to me that this is a rare opportunity for reckoning with all kinds of prejudice in the past. And when you were talking about indigenous people and Wolf was going on, it's all of it. And so I am now part of a university committee to look at USC's past, and our initial charge was to look at racism and anti-racism. And I have fortunately talked without much arm twisting, talk to committee. We're telling the president we don't want to do that. We want to do all discrimination. It's not just about racism. It's not simply a black and white issue. And the panels we've organized are the pain of hate, anti-Semitism at USC, past and present, Islamophobia at USC, past and present, racism, past and present, xenophobia. And the last one we're going to have this year is going to be the pain, living with the pain of hate, student life at USC. And we want to get a wide swath of representative students from different groups talking about their experience. And this is just the beginning, because then we have the LGBT community, we have the indigenous community. In other words, we are trying to now open it up that any group on campus that wants a session talking about their history at USC, past and present, we want to encourage that. And again, I would encourage your students there too to start organizing reckonings with Hawaii's past in whatever way they want to do it, but have open discussions, because the more we bring this out from underneath the rocks into the sun, hate loses its valence when it is exposed for what it is.
So I had told these guys our session would be about an hour, and that at that point we would be burning out everyone's Zoom tolerance for staring at a screen. We do have, some interesting comments and questions that have just rolled in at the end, but I think maybe we should defer to our guests if they want to field any more. I mean, I did have one final thought of my own about both the initial question I asked about anti-Semitism and its relationship to broader issues that we're facing today in America, and to this First Nation issue, which is that ironically, both both the Native Hawaiian culture or people and the Jews have had to face some terrible things as minorities, but they've had to face terrible things from opposite ends in a way, in that the Jews in Europe were guests in other people's houses ever since the diaspora, whereas the Hawaiians have been treated as guests in the houses of the United States, or in the House of the United States, even though they are First Nation people. And I guess the main connection I see between anti-Semitism and a lot of the racism that we see here in the United States, and also the recent racism, is that, you know, from the 1850s through the rise of Hitler, Jews had suddenly acquired all these rights and had started to assimilate into European society. And so it was easy for Hitler to point to the face of the Jew in modern German society and say, this is the face of modern liberal Europe, or this is the face of a changing society. And I think that that's a lot of what's gone on in the Trump era, is that people have pointed at people of color as we start to become a minority majority population. And whether they're brown people from Latin America coming in, and they say, this is the face of a changing society, and that part becomes part of the scapegoating and demonization. So I don't know if you guys have any other comments, or if you want any of these, if you have time for any more of these questions. Wolf, Steve?
I'll take a few more questions if there are, and then maybe another 5 minutes and call it a night.
Sure.
Maybe I can just address one question which was earlier raised by Peter Hoffenberg about the looting of the perpetrators. If there was stealing and looting, and there was actually. So there, every document about the destruction of homes, or not every, but many of them also talk about stealing either by the attackers like the stormtroopers or the SS, especially rampant in Vienna, where people were blackmailed, also Munich. They blackmailed the people to give up money, or they just outright stole items which were not destroyed. And then interestingly, in some places, you have waves of looters in these homes. So first you have the original attackers, then their neighbors come in, and the last ones are children, who then even go into the children rooms and kind of steal toys and stuff. So there is a lot of looting going on in the homes, but also then with the shops. And so this is a new research topic which was also overlooked, but there is some new research in Germany now about the looting in Berlin. There's just a new study out there in a master thesis. And I think this will kind of also instigate more new research on this topic.
Okay, and there's a couple more. I am just putting up there so that everybody can have the links to their books on Amazon. And I did want to say, you know, as you were answering that, Wolf, that you guys have a fascinating study in there about all of the people who are the collaborators or who are complicit in Kristallnacht. And you talk about different groups motivated, you know, either by looting or for all kinds of, or the author of that study talks about all kinds of motivations that were affecting all of these Germans that were somewhere in between the hardcore Nazis and, you know, people who were defending the Jews who were anti-Nazi. So that I'd really strongly recommend. It's a fantastic collection of studies. And oh, I think I sent a link to your audiobook, Steve, but let me get the you know, you have so many different you have all the available editions. So here's the paperback version. But do you see anything in here you want to try and answer, Steve? We've got at this point quite a lot of questions. I'm trying to look.
I've answered a bunch of them already on in the chat room.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I'll tell you what. Let's. It's we've been on for a while. Let's call it over. I mean, best to cut it short than long.
Sure.
So, and thank you guys very much. That was fascinating, and we really appreciate your attendance. And I guess we'll follow up with you all, and we really appreciate you being here.
Thank you I want to thank the audience for all coming on a Sunday afternoon, giving up your time. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks also for me and also for the really good and interesting questions. And so thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay,
Thank you.
everybody.